Power, live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Tyler Kendall, I'm Joe Matthew. Tonight, shut the front door. President Trump with a major play to make home ownership in America more affordable by banning large institutional investors from owning single-family homes. His call for congressional action and more when we speak with former HUD Secretary Dr. Ben Carson up ahead.
Plus, the White House ramps up its pressure campaign on Venezuela days after Nicolas Maduro's capture. U.S. forcing seizing 2 more sanctioned oil tankers as part of its energy quarantine. Why the U.S. is vowing it will control oil flows from the country, quote, indefinitely. Plus, why the Secretary of State told congressional leaders the president wants to buy Greenland and what that means for the NATO alliance when Ivo Daalder, former U.S. ambassador to NATO, joins us here.
And happening now, the U.S. House taking its first votes on extending Obamacare subsidies. We'll bring you to Capitol Hill for an update on the state of play. We'll hear from lawmakers on both sides of the aisle when Democratic Senator Jeanne Shaheen and Republican Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis join us up ahead. But we begin with President Trump's big splash in the housing market today, moving to ban large institutional investors from buying single-family homes. He says it's part of a push to focus on affordability. And he's calling on Congress to codify this. The president did not provide additional details on just what exactly the effort would entail, but we get more now from Bloomberg's Kate Sullivan, who joins us live from the White House. Kate, do we have any idea how this would work?
Guys.
Kate, if you can hear us. All right, I guess we might have an issue there, technically speaking here, because this is something that moved the markets today. Institutional buyers of single-family homes, including some pretty big names and some pretty familiar ones here, like Blackstone, were down hard on this story. And to that end, with these announcements from the White House today, not only the housing announcement, but also one involving defense companies, the president targeting executive pay as he calls for faster production of military equipment. For all the ways the president impacted markets and stocks across the board, let's get to power moves now with Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, who joins us live from New York. It's one of these days, Romaine, where Washington did impact Wall Street.
Yeah, Joe, I mean, I cover Wall Street, but I pretty much spent all day today looking at what's going on in your neck of the woods in Washington. The Trump was on fire today, floating out, I guess you can call them policy proposals, if you will. We mentioned Blackstone here at one point in the day. On an intraday basis, it had its worst drop going back to April. This on the idea of Trump floating some restrictions on institutional investors investing in single-family homes. Of course, this has been a trend that really picked up steam kind of in the early aughts, but once we got to the pandemic, it was on fire with record low interest rates. A lot of these investors, including Blackstone, Invitation Homes, and quite a few others, really dove headfirst into this. And there were a lot of questions as to whether they were actually worsening the affordability crisis. You saw Blackstone actually drop on the day, but you saw names like Homes for Rent, American Homes, for rent, as well as Invitation Homes falling the most, Joe, since 2020 on that. Even home building stocks. So think of material makers like Louisiana Pacific, Martin Marietta Materials, and a few others. They also drifted lower. Curiously, though, you actually saw names like Zillow and Redfin actually move higher here. A lot of questions, though, particularly given that Truth Social post would likely require some sort of act of Congress to actually fulfill that vision for what Trump is looking for, but it certainly puts a lot of those companies on notice. I do want to turn, Joe, though, to what actually went on today in the defense sector, because that also was a huge story today. We saw these stocks get whipped around a lot, and this was largely on the idea that Trump seems to have some issue with defense contractors paying out dividends and stock buybacks if they haven't necessarily fulfilled their contractual obligations to the U.S. military in terms of delivering on projects. Initially, he did not name any of these companies, but later in the day, he did single out RTX, Raytheon, for, in his words, for not necessarily being up to snuff with regards to delivering those projects. Those stocks got battered around in the cash session. But after hours, Joe, they actually started to rally. And that was largely because of another Truth Social post where Trump seemed to suggest he wanted to see the U.S. military budget go up 50% to $1.5 trillion. I don't know where to start. I don't know where to begin. I don't know where to stop, Joe. But today on Wall Street, this was all about what was happening there at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.
But wait, there's more, Tyler.
I'm sorry to do this to you, Romaine.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, Defense goes into the geopolitics, which, of course, we have been tracking all day here on Bloomberg, learning earlier today that Venezuela's state-owned oil and gas company is in negotiations with the U.S. When it comes to Venezuelan crude. Just a whole slew of headlines, including that the president's going to meet with the private sector on Friday. What's been the reaction there?
Yeah, all eyes are on that. And, of course, I mean, we saw oil stocks get battered around a lot. The big beneficiaries of this so far have been actual oil refiners. Think Valero, Phillips 66, Marathon Petroleum, and even Chevron. They stand to benefit partly from all of this, but everyone else is kind of left out in the cold, not necessarily because we know where prices are going, but the uncertainty as to exactly how we resolve this issue. Remember, Trump came into this morning saying that Venezuela was going to return something like $2.8 billion worth of oil back to U.S. companies. Later, we had that report that at least 2 ghost tankers were actually seized by the U.S. military out in the ocean. And then, of course, this big meeting, which is supposed to happen by the end of the week with oil executives, exactly how they're going to be involved in the build out of the energy infrastructure in Venezuela and whether it's actually going to be financially beneficial to them. We talked to a lot of investors here, Tyler, and they're actually questioning whether some of these oil companies really want to be that involved in this. The idea that the cost-benefit analysis might not actually be in their favor, certainly not in the short term.
Wow. Lot to cover.
Anything
with
else?
Romaine.
Yeah.
That was we're going to be working on it, by the way. Come back later this hour. Romaine Bostick live in New York, doing God's work as always. As we turn now back to the White House, Kate Sullivan is on the North Lawn right now. And Kate, the president has just been very busy today on social media and took to Truth Social early this morning to say that some 50 million barrels of crude oil were essentially going to be gifted to him by Venezuela. He says he's immediately taking steps here. Well, that's a different one from earlier when we talk about housing. Kate, why don't you help us out here and tell us what's happening with the oil from Venezuela?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, as you've been covering on the show, Venezuela's been a huge story this week after the stunning raid and capture of Maduro at his home over the weekend. You know, this continues to be we're learning in real time, really, what the future holds in Venezuela, what the U.S. involvement is going to be. We have been pressing officials and not getting a lot of concrete and specific answers on this. We did learn that the U.S. seized 2 tankers today. One of them was a Russian flagged tanker, and we're definitely watching for any further escalations with Moscow. We also heard from Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who was up on Capitol Hill, and he said that the U.S. was going to seize and sell some 30 to 50 million barrels of oil. You know, but like I said, there are a lot of questions still about what exactly is going to happen here after that stunning raid that happened over the weekend.
Yeah, Kate, thank you so much. Bloomberg's Kate Sullivan live from the White House this evening. Secretary of State Marco Rubio earlier today said there's already progress in Venezuela. A lot of questions about timeline here, citing President Trump's announcement on oil from the country that Kate just mentioned. Did not provide, though, a timeline on oil moving out of Venezuela when asked by a reporter. Take a listen.
I'm not going to give you a timeline on it. We want it to move as soon as possible. But we didn't expect this would. It's been 3 days since this happened, 4 days since this happened. So I understand that in this cycle and society we now live in, everyone wants instant outcomes. They want it to happen overnight. It's not going to work that way. But we're already seeing progress with this new deal that's been announced and more deals to follow. You're already seeing how the leverage the United States has over those interim authorities is going to begin to lead to positive outcomes.
Joining us now with her reaction, live from Capitol Hill, an important voice when it comes to geopolitics. Democratic Senator Jeanne Shaheen of New Hampshire is with us, the ranking member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, also a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee. And Senator, it's great to see you. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. I hope the year is starting out well for you. With regard to what the president is talking about here, what Marco Rubio is talking about, I know that you received a very important classified briefing earlier today from members of the administration. Were you satisfied with what you heard as a basis to justify these actions?
Well, as your reporter pointed out, there's still a lot of unanswered questions. And as I understand, our ability to control that Venezuelan oil depends a lot on our the embargo and having our ships in the waters off the Venezuelan coast. Our effort to seize ships, while I certainly think whatever we can do to shut down the shadow fleet that's allowing oil to continue to fuel Russia and China in their efforts is important. It does put at greater risk our men and women in the military. We now have 15,000 service members in the Caribbean area of operation, and It's not clear how long they're going to be there, how long this embargo is going to continue of Venezuela, and ultimately how we're going to see a transition to a democratic government there.
Well, the U.S. Energy Secretary Christopher Wright earlier today at an energy conference put a little bit more of a finer point on what you're talking about when it comes to this leverage and using the oil embargo. Take a listen to what he had to say earlier today.
If we control the flow of oil, the sales of those oil, and the flow of the cash that comes from those sales, we have large leverage. We need to have that leverage and that control of those oil sales to drive the changes that simply must happen in Venezuela.
There's been talk and reporting that the sale of Venezuelan oil could go on indefinitely. That's the word that we keep hearing being used. Are lawmakers prepared to monitor that revenue? Have there been any sorts of conversations on Capitol Hill about what that would look like in practice?
No real specifics on that. And again, the challenge there is we can only continue to control the oil that's coming and going from Venezuela if we have 20% of our fleet off the coast of Venezuela, if we are able to interdict those ships that are coming and going that are part of the shadow fleet that we want to stop. And that's going to cost a lot of money. It's going to put service members, continue to mean service members are going to stay in that Caribbean area of operation. And it means that the focus is going to be on that as opposed to on health care, the millions of people in this country who are losing their health insurance because those premiums are going up with the expiration of the tax credits. It means that the affordability of the cost of living that people are facing is not being addressed. And that's what I'm hearing from my constituents as a concern.
Well, Senator, there's another matter that I know you were briefed on earlier this week, and that's the matter involving Greenland and the president's designs on taking it over, as he suggests. Stephen Miller, the president's advisor, has been saying that it is our right, it is our rightful place to occupy Greenland. And Secretary of State Marco Rubio, from what we understand in his briefing with your committee with Armed Services, said that President Trump plans to buy Greenland. Is that how this ends?
Well, I think that's a crazy idea. Greenland is an important place. And the fact is our ally, Denmark, has Greenland as a protectorate of Denmark. And Denmark has been very clear that they're willing to partner with us on anything we want to do in that area. So the fact that the president and his advisors would be talking about undermining the transatlantic alliance, NATO, over his notion that Greenland needs to be part of the United States makes no sense at all. It's a crazy notion, and it needs to be stopped now.
You're going to be meeting with the Danish ambassador tomorrow, Senator. What will be your message?
It will be a bipartisan meeting, and I think we are going to try and reassure the Danish ambassador that we think this is a crazy notion, that it doesn't make any sense, and that we are very appreciative of the work that we have done with our ally Denmark. It's been historically one of our strongest allies. It's been a strong member of NATO, and it makes no sense for the president to alienate our ally Denmark, as well as other allies in Europe, undermine NATO, the strongest security agreement in history, because he wants to be a strong man and thump his chest and talk about how he's going to take control of Greenland.
Are there any active discussions about what a U.S.-Denmark bolstered alliance would look like? Are there talks about economic cooperation deals, critical minerals, maybe the U.S. moving more forces into the region in order to avoid the escalation that's been put on the table?
Well, the Danish Prime Minister has suggested that Denmark is willing to work with the United States and Greenland are willing to work with the United States in a variety of areas that we may be interested in partnering with. So I think, yes, there is a willingness to do that. And what we've heard, we haven't heard anything from the White House in terms of their willingness to talk to our partner, Denmark, about how to move forward in a way that works cooperatively instead of trying to take over Greenland.
Senator, we'd be remiss if we didn't ask you about domestic policy for a moment, because there's an important vote in the House today on extending Obamacare subsidies. A floor vote following the procedural is set for tomorrow, and there are big questions about whether this is going anywhere in the United States Senate. The president said something pretty interesting here, asking Republicans yesterday for flexibility around Hyde. And I'm wondering what you're hearing from your Republican colleagues, if a deal might be at hand.
Well, I think the president's comments on Hyde were helpful. What I hope is that the House is going to give a strong vote on those extension of the premium tax credits. That will send the bill over to the Senate. A bipartisan group has been working on trying to come up with a compromise on addressing the extension of the premium tax credits. I think we've made a lot of progress. Hopefully we'll get that House bill and have a vehicle that we can then pass out of the Senate and send it back to the House. And I hope the president will finally get engaged on this issue in a way that will allow us to make progress and get this done, because we have thousands of people in my home state of New Hampshire that are going to lose their health insurance, that are already seeing their premiums spike in a way that they can't afford. Millions of people across the country.
All right. Democratic Senator Jeanne Shaheen of New Hampshire, thank you so much for joining us. And coming up, we'll turn back to President Trump's pitch for housing affordability and discuss with Dr. Ben Carson, former Secretary for Housing and Urban Development under the first Trump administration. That's up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Tyler Kendall. And President Trump announced he would move to ban institutional investors from buying single-family homes as part of a push to address housing affordability. The president saying he's taking immediate steps and calling on Congress to codify it, adding in part, quote, "People live in homes, not corporations." Joining us now with his insight is Dr. Ben Carson, former Secretary of Housing and Urban Development under the first Trump administration and now White House Nutrition Advisor. Mr. Secretary, thanks so much for being here. Will this idea really bring down housing costs, particularly when we hear a lot about the need for a streamlining when it comes to the local and state level? Is this really something that's going to help if it comes from the federal level?
Well, we certainly need to be talking about this and coming at it from a lot of different angles. You know, I think back to my first home. I was 33 years old when I bought my first home, and it cost $126,000. The very same home now is $606,000, and people's salaries haven't gone up commensurate with that. So when people are complaining about not being able to afford homes, there's rationale behind that. And, you know, some people are taking advantage of that by saying, let's consolidate all the housing, the institutional builders. And that's not really the American dream. The American dream is to have your own home, your own property, be able to manage it the way you want, raise your family the way you want. And so these are two things that are battling each other. And what the president is doing is trying to prevent the leftist ideology of gathering all the people together into one place and controlling the situation themselves. Less government control is what we really need, more individual control.
I'm curious about the politics behind this, Doctor, and whether this is something closer to Bernie Sanders than Bernie Moreno, who says he's going to write up the legislation on behalf of President Trump. Is this a plan to target big business? Is this conservative in principle?
Well, big business is the only one who can afford to buy large groups of homes. So in that sense, yes. But, you know, there's no battle against big business. There's a lot of big business people who love America, who love the freedoms that we have, and who will fight for them. So I think it's wrong to categorize it as anti-big business.
Was this idea floated at all under the first Trump administration when you were leading the admin's housing policy? I'm curious why we're seeing this proposal come out now.
Well, what we did in the first Trump administration is try to make it easier for people to be able to buy homes through some of the new regulations through government subsidies, and looking at different ways of qualifying people for home loans. And I think that was very effective. But we were also very concerned about the consolidation and the packing of people into single places where they could be controlled. And that is not going away.
Well, Doctor, I've got to ask you, by way of your role involving nutrition at the White House, you're the president's nutrition advisor. And we've got a new food pyramid today, which is pretty remarkable here because it's upside down. And we spent some time looking at this, having heard earlier from the leader of the FDA here on Bloomberg TV and radio. When that goes upside down, we see whole grains now at the bottom and things like steak, chicken, and turkey up at the top. Now, Doctor, I don't know if you want me eating steak every night, but I'll do that if you tell me it's healthy. Is this what Americans should be following?
Well, I think it's not so much the steak as it is the protein. And we emphasize the fact that there are many different ways to get protein, as opposed to, empty calories and useless types of fat. So what we have to recognize is people are saying it costs too much. We've done what we've done out of convenience and out of necessity because people can't afford healthy foods. Well, that's simply not true. That's sort of like if you have a high-powered car, expensive car, you're going to put premium gas in it. And then if you say, well, maybe it won't cost me as much if I put this cheap gas in it, well, it may not go as far, it may not be as energetic. And then you say, I don't like the way the gas smells. Let's put some maple syrup in it. It won't go very far, and pretty soon it won't go at all. And it's going to cost you a lot more to replace that engine than it did to take care of it in the beginning. You're going to pay for it in the beginning or in the end. It's a lot more expensive in the end. So we're trying to point people to ways to nourish their bodies naturally. Because when the food comes out of the ground, when the farmers and the ranchers give it to us, it's good, but we highly process it. We get all the good nutrients out. We put all the artificial things into it, and then it's not good. And that's manifested by the fact that our longevity is going down. In other places in the world, it's going up, where they don't do all of this intervention.
In the final 30 seconds, Dr. Carson, does this go hand in hand with the president's priorities when it comes to lowering the cost for GLP-1s? Was that part of the decision-making for this new food pyramid?
Lowering the price of the food, you mean?
No, related to lowering the cost of GLP-1 weight loss drugs. Was that taken into consideration?
That's not really a part of the food pyramid or the changes that we're making. But do remember when the guidelines first emerged in 1980, 45 years ago, since that time and now, we've had a massive increase in overweight people and unhealthy people with chronic diseases. So this is a very serious issue, and we've got to pay a lot of attention to it. We're not going to let it slip away from us like they did last time.
Stocking up on protein with Dr. Ben Carson, former Secretary of Housing and Urban Development in the first Trump administration. He's now White House nutrition advisor. And Doctor, it's great to have you back on Bloomberg. We thank you for the insights. Coming up, President Trump renewing his push to, yes, acquire Greenland. As we discussed with the senator, he's not ruling out the use of military force. We'll talk about it ahead with Ivo Daalder, former U.S. ambassador to NATO, only here on Bloomberg.
Acquisition of Greenland by the United States is not a new idea. This is something that presidents dating back to the 1800s have said is advantageous for America's national security. The president has been very open and clear with all of you and with the world that he views it in the best interest of the United States to deter Russian and Chinese aggression in the Arctic region.
It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio alongside Tyler Kendall. I'm Joe Matthew. That, of course, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt talking today about the president's plans for Greenland. NATO members are continuing to sound the alarm here as the administration reaffirms Trump's push to acquire the territory. Not a joke. Joining us now with insight, Ivo Daalder, former U.S. ambassador to NATO in the Obama administration, now senior fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center. It's great to see you, Mr. Ambassador. Welcome back to Bloomberg. The Danish prime minister says a U.S. takeover of Greenland would mean the end of NATO. Is he right?
Well, it will certainly put a stop to NATO as a functioning organization. And what is particularly sad is that NATO is actually the answer to the problem that the president and his administration have identified. If the issue is how do we best deter Russia and China in the Arctic, the answer is NATO. 7 out of the 8 nations in the Arctic are members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The United States is one of them. Denmark, which owns Greenland, is another. And of course, so are Canada and Iceland and the Nordic countries. And so the best way to deter Russia is to strengthen NATO's presence and capabilities in the Arctic. Indeed, that's exactly what NATO in Brussels is discussing this very day. How do we beef up our capacity to deter and defend our interests and our territory in the Arctic? The one way in which you weaken that is for the United States to say, you know what, we don't want to do it through NATO. We're just going to take Greenland because we want to do it ourselves. That not only weakens deterrence of Russia, but it also divides the very alliance that is meant to help the United States protect its interest in the Arctic. So this is a fool's errand. And a dangerous one at that is not going to achieve the goals that the president has laid out.
Mr. Ambassador, I'm wondering if you can put into context for us, though, is the U.S. behind the curve when it comes to the Arctic? You're talking about Russia and China, and those are usually the reasons that we see President Trump say that there's this strategic liability. Is he right in that sense? Should the U.S. be doing more in the region?
Yes, the U.S. should be doing more in the region, but it's much better to do that with the 6 other NATO members, all of whom actually are Arctic nations, all of whom know how to train and operate in the Arctic. In fact, those Danish dog sled soldiers that the president the other day was laughing about are the ones who are out there way up in the north to protect Greenland against Russian and Chinese interference. This idea that Russian and Chinese ships in large numbers are surrounding the island is ludicrous. It's not true. Much of this island is surrounded by ice for most of the year, certainly in the north. And the best way in which you secure it is to work together with those countries, Finland, Norway, Canada, Sweden, Denmark, Iceland, that have the capacity to operate in the north and that know how to do so far better than the United States, by the way, and to do it together. And for the U.S. to say, no, we're going to just take it over and abandon the very alliance that has made us secure for the last 76 years is, as I said, a fool's errand.
Ambassador, before you joined us, we were talking to Senator Jeanne Shaheen, who was briefed by Marco Rubio on Monday about the president's intentions in Greenland. He played down the idea of a takeover or some sort of military operation, which I realize the White House has not ruled out, but said rather Donald Trump wants to buy Greenland. And I'm wondering what you think of that approach. If that's the case, could this be a hostile takeover? We've heard it floated before. The president offers $1 million to everyone who lives in Greenland. That's about 57,000 people. Would they take the money?
Well, he can try to offer it, but unfortunately, the people of Denmark are one side of the decision. The government of Denmark is one part of the decision, and the people of Greenland are other part of the decision. So far, the people of Greenland have given no indication that they want to trade their status as part of Denmark for being part of the United States. To the extent they have any desire, and even that is a minority, it is to be independent from both Denmark and the United States. But again, here's the issue. What is this about? Do we want territory for territory's sake? We have plenty of it. Or do we want security? And if we want security, taking over Greenland is the one way in which we're going to reduce our security. In fact, working with our allies and partners in NATO is the way to enhance our security. Denmark has been an extraordinary ally of the United States. It has deployed with the United States in Afghanistan, suffered more casualties per capita than the United States did. It has provided more aid as a part of GDP than any other country in Europe towards Ukraine. It is with us at every point in the fight. It will be with us in the Arctic. The only way we're going to destroy that alliance is by deciding that we should buy it, or we should take it, or we should get it, or whatever else it is. This is the 21st century. We work together with other countries because that's how we become secure. It's the lesson we learned from 2 world wars and the kind of 19th century imperialism that the president, for reasons that are completely unclear, wants to return back to.
Well, I am wondering if there is any connection between what we're talking about here when it comes to the president's rhetoric around Greenland and NATO, but also what we're seeing play out when it comes to the negotiations to end the war in Ukraine, because this week we saw a breakthrough when it comes to the U.S.'s security guarantees, which was broadly applauded by our European allies. Are there 2 different stories happening here, sort of a push and pull when it comes to this White House's relationship and rhetoric towards the NATO military alliance?
Yeah, there is. And the president, of course, also had a True Social post this morning about how wonderful we are to NATO and how horrible NATO is to us, even though the only time Article 5 was ever invoked was when the United States was attacked. I mean, the problem here is that if you want to provide a real security guarantee, as was supposed to have been done yesterday in the discussions with European allies for Ukraine, then at the same time to say, but we're going to attack or take over another NATO country sort of undermines the credibility of that security guarantee. So we're really working at cross purposes here. It's not that we're trying to trade a security guarantee for Ukraine in favor of taking over Greenland. No, it's our threat to take over Greenland that is weakening our ability to bring peace to the war in Ukraine, and indeed to provide security guarantees to NATO. There's an incoherence in this administration, in part because the president governs by whim and everybody else just does whatever he says he needs to do. What we need is a more coherent policy towards Europe, towards Ukraine, and towards much of the rest of the world. And that policy should be based on something that American presidents since 1941 have agreed to, which is that our security depends on the security of Europe, and that we're in Europe not because it's important for Europe, but it's because it's important for us.
All right, Ambassador. Ivo Daalder is the former U.S. ambassador to NATO. We thank you, as always, for your insights. Now to some of the other big stories that we're covering in today's Power Brief. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is calling for a special session in April to redraw Florida congressional maps, joining the rush of unprecedented mid-decade redistricting. Well, Florida's 2026 legislative session starts next week. DeSantis says he wanted to wait for a possible Supreme Court ruling on whether or not the Voting Rights Act that bars discrimination in voting systems is constitutional. The Republican-led legislature could secure some last-minute seats during the midterms, which would go a long way in the Republican Party retaining control of the closely divided House.
And protesters in Minneapolis took to the streets marching against federal authorities after a woman was shot and killed during an ICE raid. The president commenting on the incident a short time ago, alleging the woman was a, quote, professional agitator who, quote, violently, willfully, and viciously ran over the ICE officer who seems to have shot her in self-defense. Over 2,000 immigration agents and officers were sent to Minneapolis and St. Paul as part of an immigration crackdown tied to the allegations of fraud involving Somali residents. The incident has inspired protests against the presence of ICE in Minneapolis. Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey condemned the incident in a press conference just moments after the shooting.
What they are doing is not to provide safety in America. What they are doing is causing chaos and distrust. They're ripping families apart. They're sowing chaos on our streets. And in this case, quite literally killing people.
Coming up, we'll turn our attention back to Capitol Hill to discuss the state of the ACA premium subsidies vote when Republican Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis joins us live next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Tyler Kendall. There was movement today in the defense industry as President Trump weighs an executive order to block companies from issuing stock buybacks and dividends. Joining us now with the latest from Las Vegas, where our special coverage of the Consumer Electronics Show continues, is Ed Ludlow, co-host of Bloomberg Tech. Ed, I know that you just spoke with the founder of Anduril, a private defense company. What did he have to say to you about the president's latest post?
Yeah, this is Palmer Luckey, who is, he, along with the company Anduril, very closely followed private company startup. they compete with the likes of Lockheed and Raytheon for the same contracts. And basically I said to him, well, tell us then how much you pay yourself if the president is proposing a cap on salaries of executives in the defense industrial base of $5 million. His answer was, well, I pay myself $100,000 a year, but of course most of his net wealth and comp is in the form of ownership of that company. But he made the point that, like, look, while Anduril is behind in a number of projects, it is ahead in many others, and he felt that ultimately this is taxpayer money. And if it's taxpayer money, then the taxpayer should have a right to hold executives of those government contractors to account and say, well, you haven't performed, so until you do, there isn't a reward.
Really interesting. Are we in a process then of codifying two different classes of defense contractors, Ed? Maybe we were already there. I know that you've been very deep with this. If Anduril was public, I'm guessing it would have been higher today, kind of like AeroVironment. Yeah. Well, the main line, the old line defense contractors tipped lower. Is that where we're going?
But we're not there today, right? You know, the data that we can track is the unclassified missile defense spending via the Pentagon. You know, between 2017 and the middle of last year, it's more than $100 billion. 50% of that goes to Lockheed Martin. A very big chunk of that goes to Raytheon. Collectively, Anduril and this other cluster of small startups, private companies, they're in the several hundred millions of dollars. So the scale isn't quite there yet, even if this administration, this Pentagon and other defense apparatus of this country is more engaged with Silicon Valley and is more willing to back them on significant projects. And again, though, Anduril does compete with those legacy primes for the same kind of deals. It's just at a much smaller scale. And you know, by Palmer Luckey's own admission, and I'd encourage your audience to watch the interview when we publish it in full, there are projects they're behind in as well.
And what else are you watching for in your continuing coverage? It has, of course, been a big week. There's a lot of talk about the AI boom and spend being here to stay. What are some of the other headlines you can give us for the remainder of your coverage?
Yeah, I mean, the big story today on the sidelines, and it's a follow-on with NVIDIA, is a national security one, right? Can NVIDIA, the world's most important chip company and arguably AI company, export some form of chip to China? The Information had a report that government officials in China have asked tech companies to halt that while they ponder whether it's a good idea. And I'll just remind you of my reporting on this domain and what Jensen Huang and other NVIDIA executives have said in the last 48 hours. There is a spectrum of China hawkishness in DC. And at one end of the spectrum, you have people in close proximity to the president who say it's better to sell a technology into China, albeit deprecated behind the latest generation, because if you don't, then China will occupy the vacuum with its own domestic players. Where we left it with Jensen Huang in the interview that we had with him is NVIDIA is not talking with the Chinese government directly, but demand from Chinese technology companies is very high. That, in aggregate with some supply chain issues right now in memory chips, in pricing, that's the continued conversation here. And remember, for loads of people, CES is speed dating. Executives, government officials, best way to start the year.
All right, Ed Ludlow, co-host of Bloomberg Tech, thanks so much, as always. And House Speaker Mike Johnson earlier today was discussing his push to avoid another government shutdown and his plans to fund the government as the House is moving on a Democratic discharge petition to potentially extend the now expired Affordable Care Act premium tax subsidies that caused the last shutdown. Take a listen to what he said.
This week, the House is going to advance, as you heard, the next set of the FY26 appropriations bills. We're going to continue our strides to restore regular order around here and get back to the appropriations process. We're not totally there yet on the full, what you would fully call regular order, but my, have we pushed this boulder up that hill.
Joining us now with her insight from Capitol Hill is Republican Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis of New York, who serves on the House Ways and Means Committee. Congresswoman, thanks so much for being here. It looks like we're getting breaking news as we're coming to air. Can you let us know how you ended up voting on this when it comes to renewing the Obamacare subsidies?
Well, today was a vote to actually advance the discharge petition. We will be having that debate. It seems that vote will be tomorrow on the official extension. Now, I'm opposed to a clean extension, and the reason why I'm opposed to extending those tax credits is simply because we know that there is a major problem with abuse by the insurance companies. The insurance companies that have raked in a 230% increase in profits, and they've also increased the premiums 95% and have denied as many as 1 out of 3 claims by patients. They need to be reined in here. And if we allow for this to go forward without any of the reforms that we've proposed in a bipartisan manner, we are abdicating our responsibility, our fiduciary responsibility, to the taxpayers. We know that there are over 6 million people enrolled in the Affordable Care Act that were improperly enrolled. We know that there is Social Security numbers that are being used for duplicative applications. We know that dead people have been enrolled using those Social Security numbers. And the main thing that we're proposing here from this bipartisan group of problem solvers that I'm a part of is that we want to see the extension for 2 years, but we also want to see those necessary reforms to stop these types of abuses. It is critical for many of us that we see those reforms, and we think that at the end of the day we will get those reforms. This is going to play out. It will pass out of the House. It will go to the Senate. The Senate has already denied a 2-year extension without any changes. And we believe that our legislation that I came on to talk with you about not too long ago may be the end product, and that's what I'm going to continue to push for.
Okay, that is interesting. We have talked about this quite a bit, Congresswoman, and I know where your heart is on this. I guess there's a question about whether this creates a new opportunity for a debate over health care premiums, whether the Senate will get involved in this, or if this is just a show vote, and we'll check back next year.
Well, I do believe that there is going to be something that has to be done. I think there is a consensus from Republicans and Democrats that we want to get something done, minus the fringes, of course, right? But look, the bottom line here is that the Affordable Care Act was never affordable. Premiums went up, profits went up, but yet the patient and the taxpayer were left holding the bag here, and we want to address this. Now, this gives us a 2-year window, make some reforms that are necessary, but we have 2 years then to actually get our act together and put something better, because the Affordable Care Act has simply been a failure, and it's 7% of the nation that relies on that. Half the country has private insurer, usually through their employer. And we're looking to see how we can make this program better and less costly on the taxpayer.
President Trump yesterday told House Republicans that he thinks they need to be more flexible when it comes to the Hyde Amendment, which we know has been one of the sticking points, at least in the upper chamber in the Senate. I'm wondering what you make of President Trump's comments and if you agree with that assessment that heading into the midterms, Republicans might have to show flexibility on the issue.
Look, what we have to face is the reality that we don't have an outright majority. Yes, we control the 2 chambers, but we don't have the 60-vote threshold necessary in the Senate. And so in order to get anything done on health care or so many other issues, we have to compromise. We need to work in a bipartisan manner. I know that that's a dirty word sometimes here in Washington, but I joined the Problem Solvers Caucus because I believe it. And I believe when we come together as Republicans and Democrats, we find that common ground, we find the middle way, which is often the most balanced, common sense outcome. And I think that's what the American people, quite frankly, want. And so we're working together to see how we can move forward here. I do agree with the president. There needs to be some flexibility here. I am a supporter of the Hyde Amendment, but we also need to get things done and recognize that if we're making things better from where they were just a year ago under complete Democrat control, that means we're moving in the right direction.
Congresswoman, there's a matter of funding the government. We've got a deadline at the end of the week, and the Speaker of the House has been talking about something close to regular order. Will a CR be required, or can you pass a series of minibuses to fund the government for the rest of the fiscal year?
Well, we did, as you remember, last month before we left, we did pass some 1-year-long pieces of funding legislation for the military predominantly to take care of them, to make sure that if there is a shutdown that they continue to go and be paid. We want to avoid that crisis again. But what we are seeing, I think, play out here is that there will be a number of funding bills that we will pass and they will become law. And then whatever probably there could not be some type of consensus might be some type of continuing of the current levels of funding. So I think it's going to be maybe a little bit of a mixed bag here. We're going to do our best to put forward our appropriation bills where we can find consensus. But once again, you need 60 votes in the Senate. That's the key here.
In the final minutes we have you, Congresswoman, we wanted to ask you about Venezuela and what's unfolding there, particularly around oil. President Trump has said that the U.S. could move to reimburse or subsidize U.S. oil companies going into Venezuela potentially. Would you support this? And how would this work? Would this be congressionally appropriated money?
Well, I think the president's looking at actually selling the oil that has been sanctioned and that we are intervening on, selling that at market price. Because right now it's being sold at a much lower price by Venezuela, or it was up until recently. And now we can sell that at market price and help some of these companies who are going to look to go into Venezuela and help them develop their oil industry in a way that benefits the Venezuelan people so they can move forward with some type of economy that they can live on. And then hopefully we'll also see a transition to a democracy where they would be able to have a free and fair election. I think that is the goal here. Remember, Venezuela was the richest country in South America until these socialists came in and destroyed it. And you know what they did first? They packed the Supreme Court. They did a lot of things, by the way, that some of the socialists here are proposing, seizing the means of production, government-run supermarkets, taking over private property and turning them into communes. These are things that, by the way, Zoran Mandani just proposed in his campaign for mayor and won on. So I think that we need to help them transform their nation and become independent. And they have this oil industry that is not up to its potential. Remember, American companies invested billions of dollars in assets and infrastructure that the Maduro regime came in and seized. And so we want to get them that money back and that oil back.
All right. With all of that said, Congresswoman, in our remaining moment here, there are questions about the justification and the consultation of Congress. I know you were part of an important briefing today. I believe it was for the full membership of the House. Did the administration make the case that they did the right thing?
I believe they absolutely did the right thing. We have to remember that Venezuela has a very cozy relationship with many of our adversaries. It's not just communist China, but it's Iran, it's Russia. They have helped Hezbollah. They have money laundered for Hezbollah. They have empowered these drug cartels that have poisoned American citizens. So this was the right action to bring Maduro to justice. He is a fugitive, and he needs to face the court, and he needs to face justice. And that's exactly what's going to happen.
And he's in your state of New York now, Congresswoman. So stay in touch with us on this. Republican Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis of New York. I'm sorry we're out of time, but thank you for being with us. Check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online, and we'll meet you back here tomorrow, only on Bloomberg.